Picture this. A regime that spent decades screaming death to America is now quietly crawling back to the negotiating table. A military that called itself the most powerful force in the Middle East is now watching its soldiers flee into Afghanistan, one of the most dangerous countries on earth, using fake passports and disguises just to escape. And the supreme leader who once boasted that no nation on earth could touch Iran, he's dead, killed in a precision airstrike at his own compound in Tehran. This is not a movie. This is not a hypothetical. This is what is happening right now in real time to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And today on World Brief Daily, we are going to break down every single layer of this extraordinary collapse, from the desperate backroom diplomacy to the open mutiny inside the IRGC to the chilling revelation about what Iran was really doing at those nuclear facilities buried under mountains. Stay with us because this story is bigger, stranger, and more consequential than anything we have covered in a long time. And before we get into it, if you are new here, now is the perfect time to subscribe to World Brief Daily and hit that notification bell. This is exactly the kind of story that moves fast, and you are going to want every update. Let us start at the beginning, because to understand where we are today, you need to understand how we got here, and specifically, the catastrophic failure of Iranian diplomacy that made all of this inevitable. For years, more than a decade in fact, Iran ran the same playbook: drag out nuclear negotiations, make demands, walk away, come back, stall, enrich more uranium, bury more facilities under mountains. The goal was never a deal. The goal was time. Time to develop nuclear capability without ever having to formally cross the line that would trigger military action. It was a strategy built entirely on the assumption that the West would keep talking forever. That assumption turned out to be catastrophically wrong. According to reports from multiple U.S. officials, America came to the negotiating table with one of the most generous offers in the history of this conflict. Washington's core demand was simple: zero uranium enrichment capability inside Iran. In exchange, the United States offered to provide Iran with enriched uranium, completely free for 10 full years. That would allow Iran to run its civilian nuclear energy program without possessing the capability to make a bomb. It was, by any serious measure, a remarkable offer. All Tehran had to do was say yes. They refused. But it wasn't just the refusal that told the Americans everything they needed to know. It was what happened in the room. According to accounts from the U.S. side, Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi began yelling at U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff during the talks. Witkoff, who was accompanied by Jared Kushner and other senior American officials, reportedly reached a breaking point and said directly, "If you prefer, I can just leave." And he meant it. That moment told the U.S. something it had suspected for a long time. Iran was not negotiating. Iran was stalling, again. As Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth made clear in a statement shortly before the operation began, and I want to quote him directly here, "The Iranian leadership has built nothing except proxies and missiles and drones and deeply buried nuclear factories and facilities. Peaceful nuclear ambitions do not need to be buried underneath mountains." Read that again. Peaceful nuclear ambitions do not need to be buried underneath mountains. That single line explains the entire strategic calculus that led to what came next. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched large-scale coordinated strikes against Iran. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane described the operation in terms that left no room for ambiguity. This is what he said: "On February 28th, the full strength of America's armed forces came together in a unified purpose against a capable and determined adversary. The United States Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Space Force, Coast Guard, and our reserve components integrated across our combatant commands and began coordinated operations with the Israeli armed forces of an unprecedented scale," he went on. "The U.S. Joint Force delivered synchronized and layered effects designed to disrupt, degrade, deny, and destroy Iran's ability to conduct and sustain combat operations. On the U.S. side, this marked the culmination of months, and in some cases years, of deliberate planning and refinement against this particular target set. Months, in some cases years, of deliberate planning. This was not improvised. This was not a reaction. This was a carefully built machine that had been waiting for the right moment to be switched on. And once it was switched on, the results were, by any historical standard, staggering. Now, here is where it gets truly extraordinary. According to President Trump himself, the intelligence picture leading into the strikes was unlike anything previously seen in modern warfare. Speaking to reporters, Trump described how American intelligence knew exactly who was where and when. He said, and I want to quote directly, 49 leaders. And they're talking about using people now that nobody ever heard of, even though they don't know who they are. They're studying people to be the leader that even they don't know who they are. Think about what that means. Iran's regime is now so hollowed out that they are looking at potential future leaders that even their own intelligence services cannot identify yet. The succession plan has not just been disrupted, it has been effectively destroyed. According to Iran International, more than 52 senior Iranian officials and commanders have been confirmed killed since the war began. The list reads like a who's who of the Islamic Republic's military and intelligence apparatus. The IRGC's commander-in-chief, Major General Mohammad Pakpour, the head of the IRGC's Intelligence Division, Major General Majid Kademi, the head of the IRGC Navy, senior Basij commanders, intelligence officials, missile program directors. As reported by Euronews, 3 more senior figures were killed in Israeli strikes on March 20th alone. The IRGC's spokesperson, the deputy for intelligence at the Basiji organization, and a senior commander in the Ministry of Intelligence. And then, at the very top of that list is the name that changed everything. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who held ultimate control over Iran's military, political, and strategic decisions for more than 3 decades, was killed in a precision airstrike targeting his compound in Tehran at the opening of the war. His death, as analysts at Iran Newswire described it, was the single most consequential leadership loss, immediately raising questions about succession and regime stability. That is not an understatement. That is, if anything, restrained. President Trump himself addressed this directly when speaking to reporters. He said, and the bluntness here is remarkable even by Trump's standards, "I got him before he got me. They tried twice. Well, I got him first." A reference clearly to Iran's assassination plots against Trump during the 2024 presidential campaign. The personal dimension of this conflict is not incidental. It is very real. But here is something equally important to understand. The physical elimination of commanders is only part of what is happening to the IRGC. The psychological collapse may be just as significant. We are now receiving reports of a serious breakdown in the chain of command, and not because of external pressure alone, but because of active mutiny from within. According to a reliable intelligence source, a group of key IRGC field commanders are threatening to go public and announce their defection if Iran's Leadership Council fails to deliver a political solution. These are not ordinary soldiers. These are field commanders, people who are supposed to be the backbone of the Islamic Republic's fighting force, and they are threatening to walk. Iran's own foreign minister accidentally confirmed the scale of the losses on live television. When asked how much damage the strikes had done to Iran's military infrastructure, he stumbled through an answer, trying to downplay the casualties while inadvertently revealing their severity. He admitted that 40 senior commanders were killed in the first minutes of the strike, and then he tried to argue that nothing had changed, that replacements were ready, that retaliation had already begun. Nobody believed him, not even, it seems, the IRGC members watching at home, because here is the part of this story that is genuinely shocking. It is not just field commanders threatening mutiny. Ordinary IRGC members are physically fleeing the country. Videos have emerged from Iranian border regions showing IRGC soldiers crossing into Afghanistan, one of the most dangerous countries on earth, using disguises and fake passports to escape. These are men who chose to risk their lives in a failed state rather than continue fighting for the Islamic Republic. If you want one single image that captures the morale of Iran's military right now, it is that image. IRGC soldiers running toward Afghanistan to get away. And now, with all of this as the backdrop, we get to the most remarkable diplomatic development of this entire crisis. The regime is begging for a deal. Wall Street Journal reported that Iran's new security chief, Ali Larijani, the man now effectively running what remains of the country, has made a fresh push to resume nuclear talks through mediators in Oman. President Trump himself confirmed that talks might happen, and speaking to The Atlantic, he offered his characteristically blunt assessment of the situation. "They waited too long. They should have made a deal sooner. They played a little too cute." He also addressed the succession crisis directly, noting, "The attack was so successful that it knocked out most of the candidates. It's not going to be anyone that we were thinking because they're all dead. Second and third place are dead too." Now, at this point, it is worth pausing to understand where the ceasefire negotiations actually stand, because the picture is complicated, fast-moving, and not yet resolved. A ceasefire was formally declared in late June 2025, following coordinated Israeli and American strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. According to Reuters, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu confirmed at the time that Israel had agreed to Trump's proposal for the ceasefire after achieving the operation's goals of removing Tehran's nuclear and ballistic missile threat. But that ceasefire, fragile from the beginning, has been tested repeatedly in the months since. The first major round of diplomatic talks took place in Islamabad in April 2026, hosted by Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. VP J.D. Vance led the U.S. delegation. Iran's parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf led the Iranian side. According to Time magazine, after marathon talks over the weekend, the talks concluded without a resolution or memorandum of understanding. Vance stated publicly that Iran had chosen not to accept our terms, and added that the U.S. requires a fundamental commitment from Tehran not to develop nuclear weapons. American negotiators also reportedly want Iran to dismantle its major nuclear enrichment facilities and hand over more than 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. That is not a small ask. That is a complete structural transformation of Iran's nuclear capability. Iran's demands, as reported by Al Jazeera, tell a very different story. Tehran is pushing for full acceptance of its nuclear enrichment program, the lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions, the end of all UN Security Council resolutions against Iran, the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from regional bases, and full compensation for damages suffered during the war to be paid through tariffs on ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. That last demand in particular is one the United States is simply not going to accept. And that is the core of the problem. And that brings us to the critical question hanging over everything right now. With the ceasefire expiration on April 21st approaching fast, what happens next? This is a good moment to make sure you are subscribed to World Brief Daily. Hit that notification bell right now, because when the next development breaks, and it will break fast, you are going to want to be the first to know. We cover these stories with the depth and context that most channels simply do not. Now back to the critical question of what comes next. According to Axios, as of this week, Pakistani, Egyptian, and Turkish mediators are all working around the clock to bridge the remaining gaps and bring both sides back to the table before the ceasefire expires. All parties, according to a regional source cited by Axios, still believe a deal is possible. The mediators' goal is to narrow the gaps enough to enable another round of negotiations before the April 21st deadline. But there is a significant complication. President Trump is reportedly considering resuming strikes if a U.S. naval blockade currently in place does not force Iran to change course. According to Axios, targets could include the same infrastructure Trump threatened to attack before the original ceasefire was announced. The naval blockade, Operation Epic Fury, as the U.S. military has designated it, is itself a negotiating tool, not just a military one. And then there is the Strait of Hormuz problem. Iran has one remaining major card to play: control, or the threat of disruption, of the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of global oil passes. According to Fortune magazine, while IRGC commanders have been killed in large numbers, the remaining officers are steering Iran toward a more hardline stance, favoring continued leverage over the strait rather than accepting a deal that strips them of that power. Iran expert Saeed Golkar of the University of Tennessee told the Wall Street Journal that Khamenei's death has divided the country's leadership. His words, "Because the main arbitrator is gone, the fight between different factions has started." That factional fight is not just a diplomatic inconvenience, it is a structural crisis. The IRGC, as Reuters described in early 2026, has become a state within a state. And now, according to Wikipedia's updated entry on the organization, IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi has insisted that all critical and sensitive leadership positions must be controlled by the IRGC. The organization is effectively attempting to assert itself as the dominant power in whatever replaces the old regime. That makes it much harder for any single Iranian official to commit to a deal because they are not fully in control. Now, let us talk about the Trump administration's actual strategy here, because it is more nuanced than simple military pressure. Trump has simultaneously been conducting strikes, enforcing a naval blockade, pursuing ceasefire negotiations through multiple mediators, and making a direct public offer to IRGC members and security forces to defect with full immunity. Speaking publicly, Trump said, and I want to give you his exact words because they are significant, to the members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, the armed forces, and all of the police, I say tonight that you must lay down your weapons and have complete immunity, or in the alternative, face certain death. So lay down your arms. You will be treated fairly with total immunity, or you will face certain death. That is a remarkable statement. It is not directed at the regime. It is directed at the individuals inside the regime, telling them that they have a personal choice to make and that the window for making the right choice is closing. Now, as of right now, this offer has no formal infrastructure behind it. There are no U.S. troops on the ground in Iran. The organized opposition inside the country has been largely wiped out over years of arrests, executions, and exile. There is no clear mechanism for a defector to make contact with the U.S. and seal a deal. But the signal value of that offer should not be underestimated. It is designed to accelerate exactly the kind of internal fracturing that intelligence reports suggest is already underway. There is also a geopolitical dimension here that goes far beyond Iran itself. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as reported just days ago, has urged European countries to quickly decide on reimposing sanctions against Iran, warning that Iran is violating the existing agreement. The pressure on European allies to align with Washington's position is intensifying. On April 15th, Trinidad and Tobago formally designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization. More countries are likely to follow. Meanwhile, the nuclear question remains technically unresolved. In March 2025 and before the war, U.S. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard testified to Congress that the U.S. continued to assess that Iran was not yet building a nuclear weapon, though she acknowledged Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium had grown to levels that would allow rapid development if the decision were made. That window of ambiguity is exactly what the military campaign was designed to close, permanently. What does all of this add up to? Here is the honest answer, my friends. We are watching a regime in the final stages of a collapse that it brought entirely upon itself. Not because it was too weak, not because it lacked resources, but because it repeatedly, consistently, and arrogantly chose the wrong strategy at every critical juncture. Iran had years to make a deal, years of diplomatic outreach, years of sanctions relief negotiations, years of back-channel communications. Instead, it buried its nuclear facilities under mountains, built a vast network of proxy militias across the Middle East, and assumed that the United States would never actually cross the threshold from pressure to force. They were wrong, and now the bill has come due. 49 leaders eliminated in a single coordinated operation, more than 52 confirmed senior officials and commanders killed over the course of the broader campaign. IRGC soldiers fleeing to Afghanistan, field commanders threatening open mutiny, a ceasefire teetering on the edge of expiration, with both sides unable to bridge a chasm of demands that reflects not just policy differences, but fundamentally incompatible visions of what Iran's future looks like. The fascinating thing is that even now, even after all of this, the regime cannot bring itself to publicly acknowledge reality. Ali Larijani reaches out through Oman to resume talks, and then a Twitter account claiming to be Larijani denies that any outreach happened. The foreign minister goes on television and tries to spin catastrophic losses as proof of resilience. There is a phrase for this in political science: the performance of strength as a substitute for strength itself. The Islamic Republic perfected that performance over 40 years. Now the audience has stopped believing the show. President Trump, characteristically, summed up the entire situation in a single exchange with reporters. When asked about Iran's new leadership reaching out to talk, he said simply, "They should have done it sooner. They should have given what was very practical and easy to do sooner. They waited too long." That is it. That is the eulogy for the strategy Iran chose. They waited too long. Here is where things stand heading into the final hours before the ceasefire deadline. Pakistani mediators are working around the clock. Egyptian and Turkish officials are in constant contact with both delegations. According to The Hill, there is intense pressure to get both Washington and Tehran back to a second meeting in Islamabad before April 22nd. All parties nominally believe a deal is still possible, but the gap between what the U.S. is demanding, complete dismantlement of enrichment infrastructure, handover of highly enriched uranium, fundamental restructuring of Iran's military posture, and what Iran is asking for, full recognition of its nuclear rights, all sanctions lifted, compensation paid, is not a gap that closes easily or quickly. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking. The blockade is tightening. The intelligence picture, if Trump's comments are to be taken literally, remains extraordinarily detailed and current. And inside Iran, a fight between factions has just begun. A fight about who controls what is left of the Islamic Republic, who makes the next major decision, and whether any individual or group inside the system is both willing and powerful enough to make the concessions that would stop the bleeding. One thing is certain: whatever comes next, the Islamic Republic that exists on the other side of this conflict will not be the same entity that entered it. The command structure has been gutted. The supreme leadership has been eliminated. The military's morale is in free fall. The nuclear program, the project that consumed trillions of dollars and decades of effort and brought Iran to this moment, lies in ruins under the rubble of those buried facilities. Iran expert Dan Shapiro of the Atlantic Council put the challenge bluntly in an interview with The Hill. Getting all of those other things, the nuclear program, the missile programs, and the proxies, out of one meeting in Islamabad was never realistic. He is right. This will not be resolved in one meeting, or two, or probably even three. The architecture of a new Iran, whatever it looks like, will take months, perhaps years, to negotiate. But the direction of travel is now clear in a way it simply was not before February 28th. The era of Iran as a defiant expansionist nuclear threshold state is over. What replaces it is the question that will define the Middle East for the next generation. We will, of course, keep you updated on every development as it comes. This is the story that is going to keep evolving fast, and World Brief Daily will be here every step of the way with the analysis and context you need. If you found this video valuable, please take a second and hit that like button. It genuinely helps us reach more people who want serious, in-depth coverage of the most consequential events happening in the world right now. And if you are not yet subscribed to World Brief Daily, what are you waiting for? Subscribe now, enable notifications, and make sure you never miss a story like this one. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not gone, not yet. But what we are watching right now is the most significant unraveling of a major regional power that the world has seen in decades, and we are going to cover every moment of it. Thanks for watching.